What was the Comstock lode?
The richest silver mine in the United States, the Comstock lode was also plentiful in gold. The ore deposit was found in 1857 at Mount Davidson in western Nevada, about 16 miles southeast of Reno. The discoverers, Ethan Allen Grosh and Hosea Ballou Grosh, died before they could record the claim. American prospector Henry T. P. Comstock, 1820 to 1870, laid claim to the lode in 1859. But later sold it for an insignificant amount compared to what it was worth. The mine flourished until 1865 and again between 1873 and 1882, when the Big Bonanza, a super-rich ore vein, yielded more than $100 million. By 1882 the mine had yielded $397 million in ore and had produced half the United States silver output during the period. Western Nevada had become a hotbed of mining activity, attracting numerous prospectors. Among those who made their fortune from the Comstock lode was American mining magnate and future Senator George Hearst, 1820 to 1891. He used his fortune to buy the San Francisco Examiner in 1880, which was taken over by his son. American newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, 1863 to 1951, 7 years later. Virginia City, established in 1859 at the site of the discovery, became one of the West's boomtowns during the late 1800s. By 1898 the mines at the Comstock lode were all but abandoned. Wasteful mining methods and the demonetization of silver brought its demise.
How has MTV affected the music industry?
MTV's almost immediate impact was to launch the music careers of fledgling artists. Some critics believe that superstar Madonna, who showed up on the music scene at about the same time as MTV, would not have risen to the heights of fame that she has were it not for music television. Or at least her star might not have risen so quickly. But she and other media-savvy artists exploited the new format to reach the music-buying public the world over, for soon MTV had a global presence. The video channel also gave established artists a boost by airing more than one single off a given album, resulting in several hits from any one recording. Such was the case for artists like Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, U2, and Peter Gabriel. Increasingly creative videos gave the works of album-oriented musicians longer lives and steady sales. MTV quickly established itself and the format as an integral part of the music industry. Once the format was proven viable, other music television channels emerged, including VH1, which was begun by media mogul Ted Turner and was later bought by MTV and molded into an adult-oriented music station. The Nashville Network, TNN, which aired country music videos and programming in the 1980s and 1990s, and country music television, CMT. Today, the music video remains an important tool for new and established artists alike. Media analysts also believe MTV has had an impact on modern culture. Since the channel relies on interesting visuals to capture viewing audiences, MTV is constantly upping the creative ante for artists who freely experiment with bright colors, images, rapid-fire editing, motifs, dreamlike imagery, and other visual techniques, which began showing up on other television shows, in movies, and in advertising. Some observers believe the phenomenon has ushered in a new visual order. Of course, MTV has its detractors. Critics argue that the MTV aesthetic is superficial, and that it is accelerating the movement away from traditional forms of literacy. While MTV is praised and panned in the worldwide media, there's no arguing that the music channel continues to be a window on what's hip and hot to the American youth.
Have the Olympic Games been held regularly since 1896?
No. In spite of the fact that international harmony, truce of God, is one of the hallmarks of the modern Olympic movement, the Games have been cancelled by the governing body, the International Olympic Committee. IOC, due to world events. In 1916 the Games were cancelled because of World War I. 1914-18, the 1940 and 1944 Games were called off due to World War II, 1939-45. The Games have been affected by international politics, occasional boycotts, and demonstrations as well. Though the 1980 Summer Games continued as planned, the United States and as many as 62 other non-communist countries, including Japan and the Federal Republic of Germany, boycotted them in protest of the 1979 Soviet invasion of neighboring Afghanistan. The following Summer Games, held in Los Angeles in 1984, were boycotted by the Soviets. The official reason was cited as fear, though some skeptics believed the reason to be more specific, a fear of drug testing. In 1968, in Mexico City, two African American track medalists rose gloved and clenched fists of support for Black Power, which earned them suspension and expulsion from the Olympic Village. Olympic history turned dark when the 1972 Summer Games in Munich. 11 Israeli athletes were killed in the Olympic Village by the Arab terrorist group Black September. A 1996 bombing at Olympic Park in Atlanta, Georgia also cast a shadow over the Games.
What did the Curies contribute to medicine?
In 1898 French chemists, physicists and husband and wife team Pierre, 1859-1906, and Marie Curie, 1867-1934, discovered radium, the first radioactive element, which proved to be an effective weapon against cancer. They conducted further experiments in radioactivity, a word that Marie Curie coined, distinguishing among alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Upon Pierre's death in 1906, Marie succeeded him as professor of physics at the Sorbonne. During World War I, 1914–18, Curie organized radiological services for hospitals. From 1918 to 1934 she went on to become director of the research department of the Radium Institute of the University of Paris. The Curie's daughter, Irena, 1897 to 1956, followed in her parents' footsteps, becoming a physicist and marrying, in 1926, another scientist, Frédéric Joliot, 1900 to 1958, who served as director of the Radium Institute for 10 years beginning in 1946. The pair, who were known as the Joliot Curies, contributed to the discovery and development of nuclear reactors. The Curies and the Joliot Curies were all Nobel laureates.
Why did Schoenberg face sharp criticism in his day?
The Vienna-born American composer Arnold Schoenberg, 1874 to 1951. Now considered one of the great masters of the 20th century, was derided for having thrown out the rules of composition for working outside the confines of traditional harmony. In his youth, he was a fan of Wagner's compositions, seeing each of his major operas repeatedly. A series of Schoenberg's early works reflect the Wagnerian influence. But just after the turn of the century, Schoenberg set out on his own path. The result was the 1909 composition Three Pieces for Piano, which some music historians argue is the single most important composition of the 20th century. The work is atonal, which is to say it is organized without reference to key. Schoenberg abandoned the techniques of musical expression, as they had been understood for hundreds of years. This was no small moment for the music world, and many reacted with vocal and vehement criticism. Of the outcry, Schoenberg remarked in 1947 that it was as if I had fallen into an ocean of boiling water. But he had his followers, too, among them his students. Though he was essentially self-taught as a composer, he became one of the most influential teachers of his time. It's interesting to note, however, that his teaching approach was grounded in the traditional practices of tonal harmony. He later brought order to the chaos of atonalism by developing a 12-tone serialism, showing how entire compositions could be organized around an ordained sequence of 12 notes. However, he never taught the method and rarely lectured or wrote about it.
What was the diet of worms?
In 1521 a diet, which is another word for an imperial council or an assembly of princes, was convened at Worms, situated on the Rhine River in Germany. This particular meeting had been called by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, to consider the crisis that had been brought on by the Reformation. Since Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, was instrumental in both igniting the movement and furthering its causes. He was called before the Diet to testify and defend himself. But the religious leader refused to yield his stance. He vowed to continue to make his argument against the Church. He closed his statement with these famous words, "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen." The result of this was that on May 25 the Edict of Worms was issued, declaring Martin Luther an outlaw. However, Luther sought refuge in the protection of Frederick the Wise. And the edict itself served only to galvanize the cause of the reformers.
How did Joan of Arc become a warrior?
Joan of Arc, called the Maid of Orleans, c. 1412 to 1431, gained fame for leading the French into victory over the English in the battle for Orleans in 1429. A year before the battle, the English forces had invaded northern France and took possession of an area that included the city of Reims, where all of France's kings were crowned in the cathedral. Thus, Charles VII, 1403 to 1461, whom France recognized as their king, had never had a proper coronation. It is said that Joan, an extraordinarily devoted Catholic who was then just a teen, appealed to Charles to allow her to go into battle against the English who were besieging Orleans. Though he was skeptical of her at first, she claimed to have heard the voices of saints, he eventually conceded. In the battlefield, Joan also overcame the doubts of the French troops and their leaders, who were understandably hesitant to follow the young girl's lead. She proved to them that she was not only capable but also successful. In April 1429, in just 10 days' time, Joan led the French to victory over the English, who fled Orleans. Still determined to see Charles properly crowned, Joan proceeded to lead a military escort for the king into Reims, where he was at last coronated on July 17, 1429, with Joan of Arc standing beside him. Next she determined that Charles should authorize her to try to free Paris from English control. Again the king acquiesced, but this time with dire results. She was captured by the French Burgundians, English sympathizers and loyalists, who turned her over to the English. Believing she was a heretic, by all reports Joan of Arc was clairvoyant, the English burned her at the stake in Rouen, France, on May 30, 1431. She is still considered a national hero of France. Recognizing Joan of Arc for her unswerving faith and for having valiantly pursued what she believed her mission to be, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc in 1920. The feast day of St. Joan of Arc is celebrated on May 30.
Who was John Peter Zenger?
John Peter Zenger, 1697 to 1746, was a New York City printer who was accused of seditious libel in 1735. His case changed the definition of libel in American courtrooms and laid the foundation for freedom of the press. The German-born Zenger immigrated to the American colonies in 1710, when he was 13 years old. He found a job as a printer's apprentice, working on the colony's official newspaper, the New York Gazette. 15 years later he began his own operation, which was mostly concerned with printing religious pamphlets. In 1733 New York received a new colonial governor from England. William Cosby quickly earned the contempt of the colonists, both rich and poor. Prosperous businessmen who opposed Cosby and his grievous tactics approached Zenger, offering to back a newspaper that he would both edit and publish. Zenger agreed, and on November 5, 1733, the first issue of the weekly journal was released. It included scathing criticisms of the royal governor, raising Cosby's ire. After burning several issues of the papers, Cosby had Zenger arrested in November 1734. The editor-publisher continued to operate the journal from inside his jail cell, dictating editorials to his wife through the door. Zenger's case went to trial in August 1735. Prominent Philadelphia attorney Andrew Hamilton, 1676 to 1741, considered the best lawyer in the colonies, came to Zenger's defense. Hamilton admitted his client was guilty of publishing the papers, but, he argued, that in order for libel to be proved, Zenger's statements had to be both false and malicious. The prosecution contested the definition of libel, asserting that libelous statements are any words that are scandalous, seditious, and tend to disquiet the people. The court agreed with the prosecution, and Hamilton was therefore unable to bring forth any evidence to support the truth of the material Zenger printed in the weekly journal. The defense argument was not heard until the closing statement was made by Hamilton. His summation stands as one of the most famous in legal history. He accused the court of suppressing evidence, urging the jury to consider the court's actions as the strongest evidence, and went on to declare that liberty is the people's only bulwark against lawless power. Men who injure and oppress the people under their administration provoke them to cry out and complain. The brilliant attorney closed by urging the gentlemen of the jury to take up the cause of liberty, telling them that by so doing, they will have baffled the attempt of tyranny. The 7 jury members were convinced by Hamilton's impassioned speech and found Zenger not guilty. Discharged from prison the next day, Zenger returned to his printing business, publishing the transcripts of his own trial. While colonial officials were reluctant to accept the case's ruling on the definition of libel, the case became famous throughout the American colonies. And once the colonists had thrown off England's royal rule and established a new republic, the nation's founding fathers codified the Zenger trial's ruling in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of press.
How old is Taoism?
It dates back to the 6th century B.C. when it was founded by Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, c. 550 BC. Master Lao, as he was known, believed in inaction and simplicity, which he combined with religious practices to form the mystical philosophy of the Tao, Dao, the path of virtuous conduct. Lao Tzu reasoned that since humans face a cloud of unknowability, they ought not to react to things at all. He viewed the world as a pendulum, with the Tao as its hinge. Anyone who struggles against the current of life is like an insect caught at the end of a pendulum, swinging back and forth, and suffering with each movement. But by crawling along the hinge, Tao, to reach the top, a place of complete stillness is found. Lao Tzu advised that people do away with their desires, avoiding that which is extreme, extravagant, or excessive, and steer clear of any competition. Many of these ideas are embodied in a work usually ascribed to him. Tao Te Ching, classic of the Way of Power. However, modern scholars now believe that tome to be the work of his followers. Taoism is still relevant to many today. When it was developed some 26 centuries ago, the philosophy filled a spiritual void that was not addressed by the practical doctrines of traditional Confucianism. One legend has it that Lao Tzu rebuked a young Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, for his pride. The Tao also contributed greatly to Buddhism, especially in its emphasis on meditation and sudden enlightenment. One of the great thinkers of the Chinese Taoist school was teacher and philosopher Chuang-Tzu, 4th century BC, who constructed a non-political, transcendental philosophy that promoted an individual's spiritual freedom. His self-titled work, Chuang-Tzu, is another classic of Dasein.
What impact did the Challenger disaster have on the U.S. space program?
The immediate effect was that all scheduled launches were scratched. Pending the outcome of the government investigation into the disaster, President Ronald Reagan, 1911-2004, acted quickly to establish a presidential commission to look into the January 28, 1986, accident, appointing former Secretary of State William P. Rogers, 1913-2001, as the chair. Rogers conducted a thorough investigation involving public and private hearings. More than 6,000 people, 15,000 pages of testimony, 170,000 pages of documents, hundreds of photographs, and reports of independent technical studies. Additionally, the Commission reviewed flight records, film evidence, and the recovered debris. On June 6, 1986, the Commission released its report, citing the cause of the disaster as the failure of the O-ring seals that are intended to prevent hot gases from leaking through the joint during the propellant burn. The Commission had learned that although both the National Aeronautics and Space Administration NASA, and the O-ring manufacturer Morton Thiokol were concerned about the seals, which had also been used on other shuttles. They had come to regard them as an acceptable risk. The Commission went on to say that the decision to launch the Challenger was flawed. The U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science and Technology, which had spent 2 months conducting its own hearings, also concluded that the disaster could have been prevented, citing that meeting flight schedules and cutting costs were given a higher priority than flight safety, with the blame for the disaster placed on NASA's doorstep. Public confidence in the agency plummeted and NASA's own astronauts became concerned that their lives had been put at risk. However, the Commission also made 9 recommendations to NASA, including redesigning the solid rocket booster joints, giving astronauts and engineers a greater role in approving launches, reviewing the astronaut escape systems, regulating the rate of shuttle flights to maximize safety, and reforming the shuttle program's management structure. A turnover of personnel, which included some astronauts, resulted at the Space Agency, which spent almost 3 years rebuilding. It was not until September 29, 1988, that an American shuttle again flew in space.
How did the Renaissance spread from Italy to the rest of Europe?
Eventually the ideas born in Italy during the 1300s spread northward, which is at least in part attributable to German inventor Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, c. 1440 to 1450, before long, the spirit and ideas that were taking hold in Italy reached France, Germany, England, and the Netherlands, where the Renaissance continued into the 1600s. One of the most important figures of the Northern Renaissance was the Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus, c. 1466 to 1536, whose book In Praise of Folly, 1509, is a blistering criticism of the clergy, scholars, and philosophers of his day. Another notable figure of the Northern Renaissance was Englishman Sir Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, who was a statesman and advisor to the king. More's Utopia, published in 1516, criticizes the times by envisioning an ideal society in which land is communally held, men and women alike are educated, police are unnecessary, politicians are honest, and where there is religious tolerance. The works of Flemish artist Jan van Eyck, 1395 to 1441, including his groundbreaking portrait Man in a Red Turban, 1433, demonstrate that the principles of the Renaissance were felt as strongly in Northern Europe as they were in Italy.
Who was Adam Smith?
Scottish economist Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790, is popular with conservative economists today, because of his work titled The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. which proposes a system of natural liberty in trade and commerce, in other words, a free market economy. Smith, who was teaching at the University of Glasgow at the time, wrote, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer." The wealth of nations established the classical school of political economy, but has been faulted for showing no awareness of the developing industrial revolution. While Smith advocated both free market competition and limited government intervention, he also viewed unemployment as a necessary evil to keep costs and therefore prices in check.
When did the exploration of space begin?
The space age began on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, later referred to as Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The world reacted to the news of Sputnik, which took pictures of the far side of the moon, with a mix of shock and respect. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, 1894–1971. Of the Soviet Union immediately approved funding for follow-up projects. And leaders in the West, not to be outdone by the Soviets in exploring the last frontier, also vowed to support space programs. 4 months later, the United States launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, on January 31, 1958. Not only had the launch of Sputnik initiated the space age, it had also started a space race. The Soviet and American programs would continue to rival each other, with one accomplishment leapfrogging the other, for about the next 3 decades.
Why did the auto industry boom in the post-war era?
In the years following World War II, 1939–45, auto ownership in the United States soared from 27.5 million registered vehicles in 1940 to 61.5 million in 1960. Americans had resumed their love affair with the automobile, inextricably linking the car with the U.S. history of the post-war era. Many factors combined to bring about the automobile's widespread popularity. During World War II, the car manufacturers curtailed auto production, converting factories to military production and turning out some $29 billion in materials, including trucks, jeeps, tanks, aircraft, engines, artillery, and ammunition. With the conflict ended, automakers stepped up production to fulfill the unmet demand of the war years, and soon found themselves working to meet new demand, created by an increase in consumer spending and the growth of the suburbs. The overall prosperity of the late 1940s and 1950s produced a new spirit of consumerism. Government regulations, brought about through the efforts of the labor unions, resulted in increased wages and improved benefits, meaning Americans, for the most part, had more disposable income. Advertisers took advantage of the new medium of television to reach wide and eager audiences. The housing industry, largely dormant during World War II, built new neighborhoods around the edges of American cities, making the automobile a necessity rather than a luxury. The Big Three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, increased capacity to meet the tremendous demand, setting new records for production in 1949 and 1950. By 1960, more than 3 out of every 4 American families owned at least one car. The infrastructure raced to keep pace with a nation on wheels. Superhighways were built, covering some 10,000 miles of road. Motels and fast food restaurants went up along roadsides, and shopping centers were built outside city centers. While imports would challenge the American automakers in the decades to come, it was the U.S. manufacturers that defined the post-war era.
What is the roadmap for peace?
It is a plan for lasting peace in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The roadmap was announced by the Bush administration on March 14, 2003, after several months of working with Russian, European Union, and United Nations, UN, officials to develop the plan, which calls for a permanent two-state solution. The roadmap outlines specific, actionable steps to be taken by each side in the conflict. The U.S. State Department described it as a performance-based and goal-driven roadmap, with clear phases, timelines, target dates, and benchmarks aiming at progress through reciprocal steps by the two parties in the political, security, economic, humanitarian, and institution-building fields. In announcing the roadmap, President George W. Bush, 1946, called for an end to the recent wave of violence, Intifada, in the Middle East, for authoritative Palestinian leadership, and for Israeli readiness to comply. He asked for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to contribute to and discuss the roadmap. And he repeated his call for all parties in the Middle East to abandon old hatreds and to meet their responsibilities for peace. The plan, the last phase of which was to have been completed in 2004-05, foundered amid the daily violence of the Second Intifada, but was given new promise in May 2005 when Palestinian and Israeli leaders met in Egypt to discuss peace.
What is natural law?
Natural law is the theory that some laws are fundamental to human nature, and as such they can only be known through human reason without reference to man-made law. Roman orator and philosopher Cicero, 106-43 BC, insisted that natural law is universal, meaning it is binding to governments and people everywhere.
Why is Spain's Alhambra historically important?
The elaborate palace, built east of the city of Granada, in southern Spain, was built by Moors, Muslim North Africans who occupied the Iberian Peninsula. Spain and Portugal, for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. The fortified structure, built between 1238 and 1354, is a monument of Islamic architecture in the Western world. Its name is derived from an Arabic word meaning red, the highly ornamental palace. With its decorative columns, walls, and ceilings, was constructed of red brick. Perched on a hilltop, the Alhambra was the last stronghold of the Moors in Spain. In 1492 the palace was captured by forces of Spain's King Ferdinand. 1452-1516, and Queen Isabella, 1451-1504.
What was the dot-com bubble?
The dot-com bubble was a phenomenon of the late 1990s. When there was unguarded optimism for internet-based businesses. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a bubble has long been defined as anything fragile, unsubstantial, empty, or worthless, since the 17th century. The word has been applied to delusive commercial or financial schemes. .com refers to a commercial internet venture, which most often carries the .com suffix in its URL, or internet address. The .com bubble inflated quickly. The graphical user interface, GUI, of the World Wide Web, with point-and-click hyperlinks, was integrated into the previously academic-oriented Internet in the early 1990s, making it more user-friendly for the average person. Public use of the Internet expanded rapidly. Existing businesses realized they needed a presence on the Internet for information or marketing purposes, if not for commerce. The promise of conducting business online, where costs were wrongly judged to be low, spurred entrepreneurs. New businesses began popping up to take advantage of the commercial or e-commerce possibilities of the net. These were the start-ups. They often had no real-world, or bricks-and-mortar, correlation. They strived to make money by reaching consumers only over the Internet. Among the start-ups of the .com bubble were Amazon, eBay, eGois, WebMD, HotJobs, and Monster. Startups were known by several characteristics, because of investor optimism about e-commerce. Startups had quick access to venture capital funds, their managers were usually young, risk-taking Genzers, some of whom were unsalaried workers who signed on for the promise of big earnings through stock options. They spent lavishly on their office spaces and on employee perks. They conducted expensive advertising and marketing campaigns. And, when taken public on the stock market, in an IPO, or initial public offering, the original owners and investors were known to make huge amounts of money, at least on paper. Once the .coms were on the stock market, the technology-heavy Nasdaq was home to many. Individual investors became enchanted with them, artificially inflating their stock prices, even when many companies had yet to earn a dime. The price-to-earnings ratio, or PE, a measure of performance used by investors, became virtually meaningless when applied to the dot-coms. The height of the dot-com bubble was the January 2000 Super Bowl, when almost 20 dot-com companies paid more than $2 million each for prime advertising spots. On March 10, 2000, the Nasdaq index of leading technology peaked at 5,048.62. A year earlier the index was less than half that. Right around 2,500, and a year later it hovered around 2,000, or about 40% of its peak. In spring 2005 the Nasdaq Composite Index was below 2,000. Some called the March 2000 burst cataclysmic, but other analysts and investors saw the end of the dot-com bubble as a necessary correction, or thinning, after which earnest players could get on with building internet-based businesses that would be successful in the long run. Whatever the view, the dot-com bubble was the biggest market bubble ever seen, and many investors lost big.
Why are Pavlov's dogs well known?
Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, 1849–1936, carried out famous experiments with dogs, which were intended to demonstrate conditioned reflex. Noticing that the laboratory dogs would sometimes salivate merely at the approach of the lab assistants who fed them, Pavlov, who was already a Nobel laureate for his research on digestion, set out to determine whether he could turn normally unconditioned reflexes or responses of the central nervous system into conditioned reflexes. He demonstrated that if a bell is rung every time a dog is fed, eventually the dog becomes conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, even if there is no food present. In this way, Pavlov substituted artificial stimulus, the ringing of the bell, for natural or environmental stimulus, food, to prompt a physiological reaction, salivation. Based on these experiments, Pavlov concluded that all acquired habits depend on chains of conditioned reflexes. This conclusion contributed to the development of behaviorism.
Who were the Habsburgs?
The Habsburgs were Europe's most powerful royal family. Even if one chose to argue the point of power, there can be no arguing the longevity of the House of Habsburg. They supplied Europe with a nearly uninterrupted stream of rulers for more than 600 years. Also spelled Habsburg, which is closer to the pronunciation, Habsburg, the name came from the castle of Habichtsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle, built during the early 11th century in Switzerland. The first member of the family to bear the name was Count Werner I, who died in 1096. It was Werner's descendant, Rudolf I, 1218–1291. Who was elected King of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire in 1273. When Rudolf conquered Austria 3 years later. He established that country as the family's new home. Austria, Bohemia, Germany, Hungary, and Spain were among the European states ruled by the House of Habsburg. With only one exception, the Habsburg family also ruled the Holy Roman Empire from 1438, when Albert II was elected, until 1806. It was the reign of Emperor Charles V. During the 16th century that the Habsburg influence reached its high water mark. When in 1496 Spain's Philip I, called Philip the Handsome, 1478–1506, married Joan of Castile. 1479–1555, it assured that their son Charles V, 1500–1558, would inherit the crown of Spain, which he did in 1516. Charles was grandson to Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He also inherited the rest of what by then was a vast empire, and he ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 until 1556. Charles V is considered the greatest of all the Habsburgs, though he did face problems. Chief among these were the Protestant Reformation, opposition from his lifelong rival, Francis I. 1494–1547, King of France, and the Ottoman Turks, who were at the height of their power during his reign. Nevertheless, he was a successful ruler and his accomplishments included Spain's conquest of lands in the New World Mexico at the hands of Hernán Cortés, 1485–1547, and Peru, by Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541. In 1867 the Habsburg Empire was reorganized as the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. That monarchy was dissolved in 1918, after World War I. With the Treaty of Versailles establishing new boundaries for the successor states.
Who was Dame Margot Fontaine?
Fontaine, 1919–1991, has been called an international ambassador of dance. The British-trained ballerina achieved worldwide fame and recognition during more than 34 years with the Royal Ballet, expanding the company's female repertoire and becoming the model for the modern ballerina. In 1962, at the age of 43, Fontaine formed a dance partnership with Soviet defector Rudolf Nureyev. 1938–1993, challenging traditional assumptions about the ability of mature dancers to continue vigorous performance careers. In her later years, she continued to be active in the world of dance, helping set up dance scholarships, fostering international artistic relations, and encouraging the growth of dance institutions around the world.
What is fascism?
Fascism is an extreme political philosophy that holds nation and race above the individual and supports the establishment of an authoritarian government, where absolute power is vested in the leader. In post-World War I Italy, a fascist movement developed. Led by Benito Mussolini, 1883 to 1945, paralleling the rise of Nazism in Germany. Mussolini took power of the Italian government in 1922. Instituting programs of economic and social regimentation. Opposition to his dictatorship was forcibly suppressed. Italy became allied with Germany, under German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler 1889 to 1945. And Japan in 1936 to form the Axis powers, an alliance that was ultimately defeated by the Allied nations. Chiefly Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union, in World War II, 1939 to 45. Mussolini died by execution in 1945. Italy's fascist movement dramatically declined at the end of the war.
Who was Hawaii LOA?
He was a Polynesian chief who sailed some 2,400 miles of open water from the Marquesas Islands near Tahiti, to discover the Hawaiian Islands in the AD 400s. The islands were first discovered by Europeans in 1778 when British navigator Captain James Cook 1728 to 1779, landed on the island of Kauai and named the islands after John Montagu, c. 1718 to 1792, who was the fourth Earl of Sandwich and first Lord of the Admiralty. Captain Cook died there at the hand of the natives in a skirmish over a stolen boat.
What happened to the Ostrogoths?
The eastern division of the Goths, the Ostrogoths, were overrun and absorbed by the Huns in 370. When the powerful Hun leader, Attila, died in 453. Subjects of the Huns revolted and the Ostrogoths regained their freedom. Theodoric, c. 454 to 526, became the ruler of the Ostrogoths in 493, and it was under his leadership that the group invaded northern Italy, where they remained. In the middle of the following century, they were overthrown by the armies of the Byzantine Empire. Like other Germanic tribes, the Ostrogoths were absorbed into the various groups of Europe.
What was the Great Awakening?
The Great Awakening was an American religious movement that began in New England in the mid-1730s. At its center were the fire and brimstone sermons delivered by charismatic preachers such as Congregational minister Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758, and Anglican missionary George Whitefield, 1714 to 1770. Revivals were another cornerstone of the movement. These were evangelistic meetings that moved around the countryside. from Maine to Georgia, converting, or awakening people to Christianity not through the doctrines of the church, but rather through the individual's own experience. The theology of the Great Awakening was Calvinist, stressing the depravity of man and the sovereignty of God, and promoting the belief that faith, and not conduct, is the road to salvation. In its emphasis on the individual and its espousal that the individual is the final arbiter of truth, the movement had a profound effect on the spiritual and political character of what would soon become the United States. Since many vehemently opposed the movement, it also served to divide churches between the revivalists and the traditionalists. Thus, it diversified American religious life and promoted religious tolerance.
Who were the Vandals?
Like the Goths, the Vandals were a Germanic people who originated in an area south of the Baltic Sea in what is now Scandinavia. By AD 100 they had moved into the southern region of, present-day, Poland. But there they eventually found themselves threatened by the Huns. And so they began moving westward late in the 4th century. Early in the 5th century, the Vandals overran Gaul, in Western Europe, Spain, and Northern Africa, where they eventually settled. Between 428 and 477 the Vandals were ruled by the powerful King Genseric. Under his reign, they ravaged Rome, in 455. Their pillage was so thorough that the word Vandal is used to describe anyone who willfully destroys property that is not theirs. In 533 and 534, like the Ostrogoths, the Vandals were defeated by armies of the Byzantine Empire.
What was vaudeville?
Light, comical theatrical entertainment. Vaudeville flourished at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Programs combined a variety of music, theater, and comedy to appeal to a wide audience. Script writers attracted immigrant audiences by using ethnic humor, exaggerating dialects, and joking about the difficulties of daily immigrant life in America. The word vaudeville is derived from an old French term for a satirical song, vaudeville, which is a reference to the Var Valley of France, where the songs originated. Vaudeville made its way to the American stage by the 1870s. When acts performed in theaters in New York, Chicago, and other cities. Troupes traveled a circuit of nearly 1,000 theaters around the country. As many as 2 million Americans a day flocked to the shows to see headliners such as comedians Eddie Cantor, 1892 to 1964, and W.C. Fields, 1880 to 1946. Singer Eva Tanguay, 1878 to 1947, and French actress Sarah Bernhardt, 1844 to 1923. during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Vaudeville was the most popular form of entertainment in the country. In the 1930s, just as New York opened the doors of its famous Radio City Music Hall, which was intended to be a theater for vaudeville, the entertainment form began a quick decline. Motion pictures, radio, and, later, television took its place, with numerous vaudeville performers parlaying their success into these new media. Among those entertainers who had their origins in vaudeville acts were actors Rudolph Valentino, Cary Grant, Mae West, Jack Benny, George Burns, Gracie Allen, Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire, Will Rogers, and Al Jolson.
When did Marco Polo travel to the Far East?
Marco Polo, 1254–1324, was only in his teens when he left Venice in about 1270 with his father, Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo, traveling an overland route to the east. The Polo brothers had made such a trip once before. In 1260 they had traveled as far as Beijing, China. But upon their return home, they learned that Niccolo's wife, Marco Polo's mother, had died. So when the pair of adventurers set out again, they took the young Marco Polo with them. The Polos traveled from Acre, Israel, to Shavaz, Turkey, then through Mosul and Baghdad, in Iraq, to Ormuz, a bustling trade center on the Persian Gulf, where they intended to take a ship for the east. Seeing the ships, the travelers determined they weren't reliable transport, so they opted to continue on land, heading north to Khorasan, in Iran, through Afghanistan, and to the Pamirs, a high plateau range in Central Asia. It took the Polos 40 days to traverse the high-altitude range, finally reaching the garden city of Kashgar, China. From there, the Polos followed a path skirting the Taklamakan Desert and then rested before crossing the Gobi Desert, which they did in 30 days' time, covering some 300 miles. Stopping in Tunhuang, the center of Buddhism in China, the European travelers then followed a southeast path that would have paralleled the Great Wall, constructed in the 3rd century BC. After following the Yellow, Huanghe, river, the Polos were met by emissaries of Kublai Khan, 1215–1294. They continued with their guides on a 40-day trip to Xanadu, Shangtu, China, 300 miles north of Beijing, where they were received by Kublai Khan himself, founder and ruler of the Mongol dynasty and grandson of Genghis Khan. c. 1162–1227. It was May 1275. Kublai Khan, who was an ardent Buddhist and a patron of the arts, took a liking to the young Marco Polo, who entered into diplomatic service for the ruler. In that capacity Marco Polo traveled to India and visited the kingdom of Kampa, what is now Vietnam, Thailand, the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Sri Lanka, and India. The Polos, European courtiers who were well liked by the Great Khan, stayed in China until 1292, finally returning home by way of Sumatra, India, and Persia, present-day Iran. In 1295 they arrived back in Venice, which they found at war with longtime rival Genoa. The Polos carried with them many riches, including ivory, jade, jewels, porcelain, and silk. Marco Polo was now a man in his 40s and had spent most of his life thus far in the Far East.
Why is Beowulf considered an important work?
Beowulf, the earliest manuscript of which dates to about a.d. 1000, is the oldest surviving epic poem in English or any other European vernacular. It was written in Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons in England, used c. AD 500-1100. Its author is unknown. Categorized as a folk epic, Beowulf tells the story of a Scandinavian warrior hero who, on behalf of the Danish king, fights and kills the fearsome monster Grendel. Then slays the monster's mother, and finally engages a fire-breathing dragon in mortal combat. Because of its combination of Christian and pagan themes, scholars believe the epic may have been written as early as 700 or 750.
What is international law?
As interpreted by Dutch jurist and humanist Hugo Grotius, 1583-1645. Natural law prescribes the rules of conduct among nations, resulting in international laws. His 1625 work, titled Concerning the Law of War and Peace, is considered the definitive text on international law. Asserting the sovereignty and legal equality of all states of the world. But the notion also had its detractors, English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, among them. Hobbes insisted that since international law is not enforced by any legal body above the nations themselves, it is not legitimate. Since the 17th century, however, international law has evolved to become more than just theory. During the 1800s and early 1900s, the Geneva Conventions 1864, 1906, 1929, 1949, and the Hague Conferences, 1899, 1907, set forth the rules of war. Today, treaties, between two or among many countries, customary laws, legal writings, and conventions all influence international law, which is also referred to as the law of nations. Further, it is enforced by the International Court of Justice, a United Nations body, as well as by world opinion, international sanctions, and the intervention of the United Nations, apart from the International Court of Justice.
What happened at Watergate?
Watergate is a complex of upscale apartment and office buildings in Washington, D.C. In July 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's national headquarters there. Among these men was James McCord Jr. 1924, the security coordinator of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CRP. McCord was among those working to get President Richard Nixon. 1913 to 1994, a Republican, elected to a second term in office. All 5 men who were caught in the break-in were indicted on charges of burglary and wiretapping, as were CRP AG Gordon Liddy, 1930, and White House consultant E. Howard Hunt. 1918. 5 of the men pleaded guilty to the charges. McCord and Liddy were tried and found guilty. In February 1972, 5 months before the break-in at Watergate, President Nixon had traveled to China, becoming the first U.S. president to visit that country. In May he traveled to Moscow, where he signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I Treaty, the first such treaty between the United States and the USSR. When the election was held in November, Nixon won in a landslide victory over the Democratic candidate George McGovern, 1922 to 1998. But early in Nixon's second term, which began in 1973, the Watergate affair became a full-blown political scandal when convicted burglar James McCord wrote a letter to District Court Judge John Sirica. 1904 to 1992, charging a massive cover-up in the Watergate break-in. A special Senate committee began televised investigations into the affair. Before it was all over, about 40 people, including high-level government officials, had been charged with crimes including burglary, wiretapping of citizens, violating campaign finance laws by accepting contributions in exchange for political favors, the use of government agencies to harm political opponents, and sabotage. Among those prosecuted were John Dean, 1938. Former White House counsel, and Attorney General John Mitchell, 1913 to 1988. It was revealed that members of the Nixon administration had known about the Watergate burglary. It was also discovered that the president had taped conversations in the Oval Office. When Dean and Mitchell were convicted, public confidence in President Nixon plummeted. In July 1974, the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives was preparing articles of impeachment, including one that charged the president with obstruction of justice, against the president. The impeachment proceedings would not make it as far as the Senate. Nixon chose to resign on August 9, 1974. He was the first and so far only U.S. president to resign from office. Shortly after taking office, Nixon's successor, Gerald R. Ford, 1913, pardoned Nixon. But Watergate remains a dark chapter in the nation's history.